if you don't mind, would you introduce yourself? Also talk about how long you've been here with Team Wendy and how your roles have evolved from when you came in your first day to where you are today.
Yeah, so Ron Szalkowski, head of R&D currently. And yeah, it is a kind of long history here. So I've been at the company actually for 19 years. And I started out of an internship that I had. Went to college for chemical engineering. And when I started the company, there was a fit. They were making these polyurethane foams. That's still a big part of what we do. And the company had just transitioned from like a boutique ski helmet manufacturer to winning a defense contract to put the pads that had been developed for those helmets originally into combat helmets. And so in my early years, worked actually on some of our, basically getting the quality up to where it needed to be on that contract and being able to deliver those systems. And then I worked my way up through the ranks in engineering and pivoted more into new product development. And we really got into a phase where we're trying to figure out what else we could do, making all kinds of different products. Where else can we put this foam? And from there was kind of a couple more evolutions. The big one was then saying, actually, we're not going to be just this component manufacturer. We're going to launch our own line of helmets. And so at that point, I was setting up our new product development. And so, just kind of trying to lead to actually make that transition from just making some parts for other people's helmets to making our own helmets. And then, more recently now that we're combined up with our sister company, Team Wendy Ceradyne, it's really the next phase of, okay, how do we put the leading ballistics in with leading padding and design and, just accelerate the helmets moving forward.
Yeah, so, when I always joke with you and I call you my big brain friend, and he really is. But with that, you've been a part of so many unique projects through the years, from almost really the inception of when Team Wendy came into the ballistic market all the way through. And I know this is going to be tough, but what are some of the things that stand out, the projects that you've been involved in that make you most excited to say, I was involved in saving that life? And I guess the highlight reel, if you will, what's just a couple of those things, if you don't mind?
Yeah, the highlight reel, boy. The first one was probably this liner development project before we had actually launched into our own line of helmets, because we kind of approached it from a completely different direction. We said, okay, we've made these foams, but actually we're going to make a helmet liner out of these molded structures that are completely different. It was a very kind of wild, out there design. And it was part of a government-funded program, and we kind of submitted that design to them. They're like, that was really interesting, had some really good performance, but ultimately that project with the government didn't go anywhere. So we said, well, actually, this is a really neat design. We want to take this, we want to put this, and we built a carbon fiber bump shell around it, and that became the X-Fill Carbon. Right. That was the first helmet that we launched. So that was really exciting times. Next big highlight was when we made the jump to ballistic helmets, and we were, kind of new on the block and had just, broken through and launched the X-Fill. And we got, within a year or so of that, a big win with Australia. So Australia had gone from their previous helmet for their big army to this high cut helmet in this funky shape and kind of different sizing. And that was, really kind of validating that, like, okay, this different approach that we took really worked out.
Yeah, and on that same note, just to kind of deviate a little bit. So when we won that contract, that kind of launched Team Wendy's unique geometry, if you will, which at first I remember I was in an operational capacity back in those days. Everyone's like, what in the heck is this weird design? But can you elaborate just very quickly on why Team Wendy came up with that unique geometry and how that fits and associates with the head?
Yeah, so it had to do with how the suspension and retention worked in combination with the shell shape. So because of the cam fit retention, which we had developed prior on that carbon bump helmet, because of the way that tightens and kind of brings your head into the padding, we were able to kind of square off the top of the helmet a little bit, and that ensured that the helmet is always sitting down nicely. So if you've ever worn like a ACH kind of traditional helmet, if it's a little bit too small, it rides really high and just kind of feels awkward and doesn't sit right. And we did want to kind of improve that, and it worked really well with that specific shape, with that retention system to actually provide a better fit. then it also provided some kind of structural rigidity that helps. There's other ways to do that, to accomplish that, but that was kind of another aspect to it. And then it also it really does make it visually unique. And that was something that was, back to the ski helmet days, where it was like, hey, we do actually want this to be a cool looking product as well as function. But there's definitely functionality to it, not just form.
So that's Ron's wild side, basically. That's the showcasing. I got it. That's fantastic. It's good information. All right, so Ron, there's so much that we could talk about with you because of your history here, and it always intrigues me, and I always love learning from you. And one of the things several years ago you told me that you were involved in is this really unique project, and I'm not going to do my, but it's the PANTHER Project, as they call it. And that is a very long acronym, I understand that. But the PANTHER Project is incredibly, I believe, important, not just to Team Wendy, but to the community as a whole. So if you would be so kind, walk us through what the PANTHER Project is and kind of your involvement in that whole entire line of great thought process.
Yeah. So PANTHER it's an Office of Naval Research funded. It's a research program. It spans kind of basic and applied scientific research. And it's something where the real core of PANTHER is saying we're going to go from the small scale of what happens to at a cellular level, what happens to the brain, when it's stretched and strained and subjected to pressures and things like that, up to the macro scale of a helmet. And how do you use that to build a better helmet, or even getting outside of the helmet space into other areas. And so it's this interdisciplinary research program is the intent, that you have everyone from the biological side to materials to us on the industry side as a manufacturer. And so it's mostly university researchers involved, and that's really what it spawned out of initially. Was Dr. Christian Frank. He was at Brown University. This was back about 10 years ago, and we had a visit with him and basically saw that, he's doing this work on brain cells. He was actually a mechanical engineering, like into mechanics and how to build, he did like aerospace engineering and how do you make things fly and all this, but he got into taking kind of that thought process and looking at cells and saying, what are the forces acting on these cells and how does that affect them? How does that break them down? And so he was doing that work and kind of trying to find a way to make that work actually lead to progress elsewhere. And we're trying to make better helmets. So we're going, we need to know that kind of work. We need to, we need you to tell us how to make the helmet better so that it actually protects the brain, that these injuries don't occur. And so we started working with Christian, and he really spearheaded the program. He brought together, in the initial round of funding from the Navy, there were a few different groups involved, him and some others at Brown University. There was someone who was at Drexel University at the time. They were doing mechanics of materials, so they would test materials and see what the properties were. Sandia National Labs was actually involved.
It's a big one.
Yeah, they were doing computer modeling, because that's really the core way that we link this like micro scale to the macro scale is with computer modeling and experimentation to kind of confirm that the models are correct. But Sandia was involved and Team Wendy was involved, and we were there to make the helmets, do physical testing, run the experiments, make the materials that are being looked at. And so that was PANTHER 1. And so at the time, it was a small group, about 5 different organizations involved. We're now on multiple rounds of PANTHER, and it has expanded and been successful, and the Navy has expanded the program. So there's now, I think, over 20 different researchers involved, and more being done on the biological side, more being done on the material side, also bringing in sensors and looking at how sensors can be integrated to both detect and kind of predict injury.
Just making little PANTHER babies everywhere, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's spreading out a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, it's awesome.
And really trying to advance the state of the scientific understanding of how to do these things, so that it's not only giving us kind of head start in making a better helmet, but it's really raising the standards for helmets across the board.
Yeah, I love that. And there's so much more. Again, we could have a conversation. I love communicating with you, but there's so much more that goes into a helmet than just ballistic performance. We think that's absolutely important. We know that that is something that is a milestone, a staple in what we do. But there's also a very good chance you can just bump your head or bust your head on a Bearcat, an MRAP, just normal operations, a windowsill. The list goes on and on and on. And so you talked about the Panther Project being involved with Team Wendy. So my question is, how does that correlate? So when you go there and you do the research and you're a part of these great think tanks, then how do you bring that back here, and does that all kind of intertwine, if you will?
Yeah, so I would say that there's a few different ways that this happens. And we look at it in terms of like the 3 Bs. It's like blunt impact, ballistics, and blast. And with Panther, especially back to that first Panther project, it was really just focused on blunt impact. And we're now expanding it into other areas, and it's now going to be looking at ballistics and is looking at blast. But we will take specific problems and say this is something that we don't understand. It started with when you fall and hit your head, or something hits your head, like what does that actually do to the brain?
Right.
Because the way that even the current test standards for helmets are written, they're based on skull fracture. So this is it's like what a bicycle or motorcycle helmet is tested to. You take a big impact, you don't want your skull to fracture. But the way that the test is run doesn't really tell you anything about the brain itself. Concussion or subconcussive injuries.
Right.
Or a whole other range of diffuse axonal injury, a whole bunch of different things that can happen that aren't just skull fracture. And so those old tests, it turns out that actually if you try to model the way the brain is responding, those old tests don't even induce the kind of, it's really like a stretching of the brain tissue that doesn't really occur in the old test. You can introduce some pressures into the brain, but the science is basically pointing towards we really care about stopping the tissue from stretching too fast. And that's something where we've had to evolve the test method. So Panther kind of led us to understand that, okay, the stretching is the important thing. That was the cellular research where they're basically mapping out, okay, how fast can you stretch brain tissue? And then what kind of injury does it cause? And because that's also very complicated, there's that at least split into like a primary and a secondary. Primary being like a mechanical, physical injury to the cell material, and secondary being, okay, it actually kind of goes back to normal after the event, but then sometime later, could be hours, could be days, the cell starts failing and eventually will die. And so it's kind of mapping all that out and letting us understand, okay, how do we then test the helmet and determine where it fell on that scale to grade it.
That makes sense.
And another area it's leading to now is to have an accurate test, right? Because I talked about how the old test doesn't actually induce these kind of stretches that we care about. So we've done a lot of work more recently in Panther on a new test method, and we've actually been able to compare it to real world data. So instrumented mouth guards that people wore going through paratrooper training, and in some cases hitting the ground hard and getting concussions. So we're able to take that data and see, there's some interesting things happening here. There's an angular velocity that occurs prior to your head hitting the ground because your feet and the rest of your body are hitting first. And you kind of get this whipping motion. And we've been able to actually recreate a test that recreates that whipping motion accurately. So now we can run that test. We can build different helmets on it, and building those, testing those and seeing.
Now, is this our friend Drew, right?
This is on Drew, yeah.
This is Drew, so which we don't have to go into, but that's a big point I think we should probably discuss for a moment is, because we have this involvement, it gives us the opportunities to bring in, as we call him, Drew in here. Can you kind of walk us through, the functions of Drew and what Drew does, and again, how that really correlates to our development on pad systems? Yeah,
so Drew stands for Dummy for Rotational Evaluation of Wearables. And, there's kind of each part of that is important. That's a test dummy. We do test on some kind of surrogate, we'll usually call it, or, crash test dummy. And with Drew specifically, it's a hybrid 3, which is kind of the modern test dummy that's used in automotive testing and all your kind of car crash tests. And that has a more biophilic response, so it does have a flexible neck. Now, there's always new advances that we need to make sure that it's actually as realistic as it can be. But we're really coming from a test where it's just a rigid neck, and no one's really responding that way. Your body isn't just completely rigid in an impact. And the rotational aspect is because we do see these kind of angular events occurring in the real world, there's almost always some amount of angular velocity, angular acceleration, and that's what really leads to these tissue strains. And we're able to replicate that on that test rig. And we can really test all kinds of things on it because it's full from the torso up. So it's not necessarily just the helmet, but it's how the helmet ties in with the rest of the equipment that you're wearing. And then the real important thing is that way that we could actually evaluate out of it. So we can run that, and then we can, based on that modeling that we talked about of spanning the micro to the macro scale, there's kind of different levels. There's a level where you just run a test, and you can, based on the accelerations, do a simplified calculation that will predict how bad that was. And then there's a level where you could run it through a full brain model. So Dr. Carlson at Robert Morris University, we're working with, she's developed the RMU head model, and it's basically breaks down model the head to over 1 million small little elements.
Wow. So
you can run the math on how the forces involved in this event affect each one of these, and then that can, it'll take some time to run that kind of model, but then you get a full level of detail of, exactly where in the brain was it stretching or experiencing certain forces or accelerations, and to what level. So we can get a real in-depth understanding of what occurs during one of these impact events.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And that just really plays into the mission behind Team Wendy, which most of our viewers and those out there understand that that's how we started. To hear you talk about these things, I think is absolutely fantastic. It really puts a lot of confidence in me that we are on the forefront of technology when it comes down to saving lives. So Ron, we've talked about all these great things that you're involved in, that we've been involved in at Team Wendy, from Drew to Panther, and that is all awesome, and we love that. We also, from a granular level, if you will, how does all of that really go into creating a better product for Team Wendy, and what products do you see that technology kind of integrating in and how it flows today in the market?
Yeah, for sure, because we do want to do more than just publish research, that's a big part of the programs, but we want it to get into the product today. And I will say there's a couple ways where it really has. The main one is in our selection of foams. So because we make our own foams, from the raw materials, we formulate it, we can fine tune them in every different variable. We're going a direction in the recent past towards a certain type of foam that we thought was better based on the historical way that we've tested helmets. And what we came to find was we were actually transmitting too much energy through that material to the head. And so that it was not resulting in as good of a response from the brain as we would want. So it's actually kind of made us question the direction that we were going, and it's refocused us, and we're pursuing different directions, but it's made us actually change the selection of foams that we put in our helmets today. And so we think that has definitely helped. And then another area that's a little newer for us, although we've been working on it for a while, is 3D printed lattice structures, or kind of, we call them like architectured materials, where when we make foams, you're controlling you kind of change the response by changing the chemistry and the structure, but in a foam, those two are linked. So you can't really change the chemistry too much without it affecting the structure.
Got it.
And so we had a desire to make some materials where we could completely change the structure to make it whatever we wanted, and independently select the material that structure is made out of. And so the first application that we actually have for that are the 3D printed lattice pads in the Rifletech liner. And so that's something that we've been working on that kind of technology for several years, but we wanted to really make sure that we had it right, before we put something to market. But it's one of these areas where, like under Panther, we're researching, how to make better foams. Can we make these 3D printed structures, all the way to carbon nanotubes? And one of the collaborators at University of Wisconsin, Madison, there is making these vertically aligned carbon nanotubes. So they print like this forest of carbon nanotubes that has really interesting compression properties. We're looking at something like that, but that's realistically many years down the road in the future to be able to scale something like that. So in the short term, we've still got it going into the product today.
And that really leads me to the next question, I guess kind of the final question of the interview is, we talk about the future. We can't just stay in the past. We can't just be present in the present. we have to constantly think of the evolution, the evolving of technology in the battle space, and in our case, search and rescue, and even in some of the more extreme sports that our helmets are used on. So how do you see the future shaping up? What's some prophecy, if you will, not to put you on the spot, we're not going to hold you accountable in 10 years and go back, but what would you like to see, and how do you see the industry kind of being shaped out over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so I think a couple areas. The one is really this 3B that we talk about with blunt, ballistics, and blast. That I think we've made a pretty good amount of progress on the blunt side, and we're really at the earlier stages, but accelerating that on ballistics and blast. And ballistics, we have fantastic life-saving helmets today, but we're doing that R&D for what is the next leap going to be. How are we going to? What materials do we incorporate? How are we going to make them even better? Face new emerging threats and just give better performance against everything. And blast is a completely new front where there are no current test standards for helmets, so that's really driving the new standards. Now, on kind of all of those areas, 3 areas, I would envision that we see new test methods in place. So we see the old way of drop testing helmets evolve. We see the way that we test ballistic helmets evolve from clay head forms to something more biofidelic, and that we see actual blast standards in place and technologies to mitigate them in the helmet. So that would definitely be one of the predictions.
Yeah.
I think another area that we're really working on is, we could say, digital engineering. So digital engineering being use of basically computational modeling, so computer modeling or simulation, as opposed to the old school way of doing things, especially when we have the old traditional test specs, kind of have an old traditional way of developing to them. It's a lot of trial and error, a lot of, we have these rules of thumb that we've learned over the years of testing to this, this same method. But as we go into new methods that are actually more beneficial for the human, we don't, we lose that. And we can leverage simulation and computer modeling to actually test many more variations of something. We have to ground it in reality. So we do experimental validation to make sure that all the computer models are giving accurate results. But it will then allow us to do something like test 100 different variations of pad and shell in a matter of days that would have taken just months and huge cost through a traditional way of actually physically making and testing all of those things. So I think the digital engineering front, that's something that we're seeing increasingly used. Military and defense very interested in that for everything up to how do you build a submarine that's fully designed in a computer before you ever build the real prototype and know how it's going to respond and how it's functioning over its lifetime. It doesn't just have to be big projects like that. It can be how do we design a better helmet or even a better component for a helmet.
Right.
We can still speed it up with that.
That makes sense, man. Well, I appreciate it. As always, Ron, it's great listening to you. I always get intrigued just to hear, as I always say, my big brain friend over there. I want to say thank you again for your time.